The first punch landed so hard that every conversation inside the gym stopped. 8 seconds later, nobody was laughing anymore. The champion who had walked into the ring expecting an easy victory was standing completely still, staring at the single father in front of him as if he had just seen a ghost. The crowd had gathered expecting entertainment. They expected the tired-looking construction worker with worn shoes and an old hoodie to be embarrassed by a professional Muay Thai fighter. Nobody expected what happened next. And nobody in that crowded gym knew that the quiet man they were watching had spent years running from a past he had sworn never to reveal. Before we go further, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that someone's past does not have to determine their future, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because stories like this are meant to reach people everywhere. His name was Daniel Carter. At 38 years old, Daniel did not look like a fighter anymore. His shoulders were still broad from years of physical work, but his body carried the exhaustion of a man who had learned to survive rather than compete. He worked long shifts at a construction site during the day, delivered food whenever he could find extra hours at night, and came home every evening to a small apartment where his 8-year-old daughter, Emma, waited for him. Emma was the reason Daniel woke up every morning. She was the reason he worked until his hands were cracked and bleeding. She was the reason he had stopped thinking about himself years ago. Daniel had become a single father after his wife, Rachel, died unexpectedly following a long illness. There had been no dramatic goodbye, no perfect final conversation, and no warning that prepared him for the silence that followed. One week Rachel was still asking him whether he had remembered to buy Emma's favorite cereal. The next week, Daniel was standing in a hospital hallway holding his daughter while doctors explained that her mother was gone. Emma was only 4 years old then. She did not fully understand death. She kept asking when mommy was coming home. Daniel never found a good answer. Years passed, and Daniel learned how to braid Emma's hair even though his fingers were clumsy. He learned how to pack school lunches, sew loose buttons, help with homework, make pancakes shaped like stars, and sit beside her bed when nightmares woke her. He became both parents without ever pretending it was easy. But there was one thing he never told Emma about himself. Before he became a construction worker and a father, Daniel had been a fighter. Not an ordinary fighter. He had once trained in Muay Thai under a respected coach named Marcus Reed. Daniel had been young, disciplined, and dangerously talented. His dream had been to fight professionally. He had traveled, competed, won tournaments, and earned a reputation for being calm under pressure. But one night, during a major fight, something happened that changed everything. Daniel's opponent suffered a serious injury after a brutal exchange, and although doctors eventually confirmed that the injury was not Daniel's fault, Daniel blamed himself. He walked away from competition soon afterward. He never returned. When Rachel became sick, fighting disappeared completely from his life. After she died, he buried whatever remained of that old identity even deeper. He sold his gloves. He stopped visiting gyms. He avoided old friends. He wanted Emma to know him only as her father, not as the man he had once been. But life has a strange way of bringing buried memories back. One Saturday morning, Emma had a small charity event at a local martial arts gym. Her school had partnered with the gym to raise money for children who needed sports equipment. Daniel almost didn't take her because he had worked late the previous night, but Emma had been looking forward to it for weeks. So he drove her across town and waited near the edge of the training floor while she joined the other children. The gym was loud, energetic, and alive. Heavy bags swung from chains. Jump ropes slapped against the floor. Fighters moved through drills while coaches shouted instructions. Daniel felt something inside him tighten as soon as he stepped through the door. The smell of leather, sweat, and old mats brought back memories he thought he had forgotten. Then the crowd suddenly erupted. A man named Victor Hayes entered the ring. Victor was 29 years old and one of the most feared Muay Thai champions in the region. He had won national titles, appeared on sports broadcasts, and built his reputation on aggressive fighting and psychological intimidation. He was physically imposing, confident, and used to people backing away when he entered a room. That morning, Victor was supposed to demonstrate a few techniques for the children. But after several rounds with another fighter, he noticed Daniel standing near the wall. Victor pointed toward him. Daniel looked behind himself, thinking Victor was talking to someone else. But Victor smiled and pointed again. The gym began to notice. Someone whispered that Victor wanted a volunteer. Another person laughed when they looked at Daniel's old hoodie and work boots. Victor stepped out of the ring and walked toward him, asking whether Daniel had ever trained before. Daniel simply shook his head and said it had been a long time. Victor misunderstood the answer as fear. The crowd encouraged him to step into the ring. Daniel refused. He wasn't interested in proving anything. But then Victor made a careless joke about single fathers who thought carrying grocery bags made them tough. A few people laughed. Daniel remained silent. Emma was standing nearby. She looked at her father. Daniel saw the disappointment in Victor's expression and the curious eyes of everyone around them. More importantly, he saw Emma watching him. She didn't want her father to fight. She only wanted him to stop looking like someone who believed he had nothing left inside him. Daniel finally stepped into the ring. The gym became strangely quiet. Victor smiled because he thought the outcome was already decided. Daniel removed his hoodie. The room changed. Underneath was the body of a man who had spent years working construction. His arms were strong, his shoulders thick, and his movements surprisingly balanced. But what caught Marcus Reed's attention from across the gym was Daniel's stance. Marcus froze. He had seen that stance before. Years ago. Daniel's old coach immediately recognized him. Daniel tried to avoid eye contact. Victor raised his gloves. The bell rang. Victor moved forward quickly. He expected Daniel to panic. Instead, Daniel watched. Victor threw a fast right hand. Daniel slipped it. The crowd gasped. Victor attacked again with a combination. Daniel blocked the first strike, stepped away from the second, and suddenly moved forward. Then came the punch. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't wild. It was precise. Daniel struck Victor cleanly, forcing the champion backward. The clock showed 8 seconds. 8 seconds. The entire gym went silent. Victor stared at Daniel. Daniel didn't celebrate. He didn't raise his hands. He simply lowered his gloves. Because he knew exactly what he had done. And he knew exactly what Victor had not yet realized. Daniel Carter had never forgotten how to fight. He had only forgotten how to believe in himself. Victor's pride was wounded, and for a moment his expression hardened. But before he could continue, Marcus stepped between them. He looked at Daniel with disbelief and asked why he had disappeared all those years ago. Daniel didn't answer. He climbed out of the ring and went straight to Emma. She looked up at him and asked whether he was okay. Daniel smiled and told her he was fine. But he wasn't. Something had been awakened. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table while Emma slept in the next room. On the table was an old photograph of Rachel. Beside it was the silver chain she had worn on their wedding day. Daniel remembered something Rachel once told him during the hardest months of her illness. She had told him that surviving was not the same thing as living. At the time, he had hated hearing those words because he was simply trying to make it through each day. Now they came back to him. The next morning, Daniel returned to the gym. He didn't go there to become a champion. He went because he wanted to learn how to live again. Marcus offered to train him, but Daniel warned him that he had responsibilities. He couldn't spend every day training. He couldn't travel for fights. He couldn't risk losing the life he had built for Emma. Marcus understood. So they started slowly. Daniel trained early in the morning before work. He ran while the streets were still dark. He practiced footwork in the gym before anyone else arrived. He learned to control his breathing again. He didn't tell Emma about his old career immediately. She simply noticed that her father smiled more. At work, Daniel's co-workers noticed too. He stood straighter. He laughed. He began speaking about the future instead of only worrying about bills. But Victor hadn't forgotten the 8 seconds. Instead of becoming Daniel's enemy, Victor slowly became curious. He started arriving early too. One morning, Daniel found Victor hitting a heavy bag alone. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Then Victor admitted that he had been arrogant. Daniel accepted the apology. From that moment, something unexpected happened. Victor began training with Daniel. The champion who had once challenged him became one of the people helping him rebuild his confidence. But Daniel still refused to fight professionally. Until Emma got sick. It wasn't life-threatening, but it frightened Daniel badly. One evening, she collapsed with a high fever, and Daniel rushed her to the hospital. Sitting beside her bed, he realized how terrified he was of losing another person he loved. Emma eventually recovered. But the experience forced Daniel to confront something. He had spent years avoiding pain by avoiding everything that reminded him of Rachel. He had mistaken fear for protection. When Emma was healthy again, she asked her father whether he would ever fight again. Daniel told her he didn't know. Emma smiled and said she didn't care whether he won. She just wanted him to stop being afraid. Those words changed him. Months later, Daniel agreed to enter a charity exhibition match. The money would help children from low-income families receive free martial arts training. Victor offered to stand in his corner. Marcus would be his coach. And Emma would be sitting in the front row. The night of the fight, Daniel stood inside the locker room staring at his gloves. His hands were shaking. Not because he was afraid of his opponent. Because he was remembering the man he used to be. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. He told Daniel that he didn't need to become the old version of himself. He only needed to become the man he was now. Daniel walked into the arena. The crowd cheered. Across the ring stood a young fighter named Ethan Brooks, a talented 24-year-old who respected Daniel's story but had no intention of taking it easy on him. The fight began. Daniel moved carefully. Ethan was faster. The first round belonged to the younger fighter. But Daniel didn't panic. He remembered why he was there. Not for fame. Not for revenge. Not to prove Victor wrong. He was there for children who deserved the opportunity to find confidence before life convinced them they were worthless. In the second round, Daniel found his rhythm. He defended. He moved. He countered. The crowd slowly realized that they weren't watching an old fighter trying to pretend he was young. They were watching a father who had discovered that strength could return even after years of silence. The final bell rang. The decision was close. Daniel lost by a single point. For a moment, he stood still. Then the crowd rose to its feet. Emma was crying. Victor hugged him. Marcus smiled. Daniel looked toward his daughter. He had lost the fight. But somehow, he had won something far more important. He had won himself back. Later that evening, Daniel sat beside Emma outside the gym while the lights from the building spilled onto the pavement. She leaned against his shoulder. Daniel told her that her mother would have been proud. Emma answered that she already knew. Daniel smiled through tears. The next morning, the gym announced that it would create a free youth program in Rachel Carter's name, funded by donations from the exhibition. Daniel agreed to help coach. Victor volunteered too. And slowly, the gym became more than a place where people learned to fight. It became a place where people learned they weren't finished. Years later, people still talked about the 8-second moment when a Muay Thai champion challenged a quiet single father and the entire gym went silent. But Daniel never talked about those 8 seconds. When people asked him about them, he always said the same thing. The important moment wasn't when he knocked Victor backward. The important moment was when he walked into that gym after years of believing his life was already over. Because sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one who can hit the hardest. Sometimes it's the person who has every reason to give up, but chooses to stand again. Daniel had lost his wife. He had lost his career. He had lost years to fear. But he hadn't lost his ability to begin again. And neither have you. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who may need a second chance, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps stories like Daniel's reach people who may be quietly fighting battles of their own. And before we end, I want you to leave one special comment: I choose to stand again. Write those words if you believe that no matter how many times life knocks us down, we can still rise. Because Daniel's story was never really about fighting. It was about a father who thought his best days were behind him, a daughter who reminded him that courage doesn't disappear, and a second chance that arrived disguised as 8 silent seconds inside a crowded gym. Sometimes life doesn't give us a warning before it changes everything. Sometimes it simply puts us back in the ring. And when that moment comes, you don't have to be fearless. You only have to take one step forward.